Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I am your host, Steve. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support The History of the Papacy by going on over to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Speaking of supporting the show, Patreon is a great way to do that. We're at patreon.com/History of the Papacy, and the History of the Papacy Patreon has 4 tiers: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome, each representing one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. And an inclusion on the History of the Papacy diptychs is your greatest benefit. The earlier you sign up, the higher you are on the list of those patrons who are commemorated. Little History of the Papacy diptychs fun fact: Pope Stephen II took over the papacy after Pope Zachary all the way back in the 750s. Wikipedia claims that Stephen II was one of the Roman noble family Orsini popes. That would be true, except the first Orsini pope wouldn't be elected for about 400 years after this time period. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William B., Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, and William H. at the Alexandria level, Dappo, Paul, Justin, Lana, and John, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Leonard the Great, and Alex the Great. As you well know, we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring Josh Cohen's Eyewitness History Podcast, among many other great shows. We are joined again today by Will Clark of the Gray History Podcast. That's Gray with an E for my American listeners and maybe Canadian listeners who are accustomed to spelling Gray with an A. Do Canadians spell Gray with an E or with an A? I'm not sure. Now, but getting back on track here, in today's episode, Will and I will look at the French Revolution and what role the church had in that revolution. This is more complicated of a topic than it appears. There was fabulously wealthy clergy and poor clergy. There was up-and-coming clergy, and there was the entrenched power elite clergy. Each of these groups had their own incentives and goals, so that's what we're going to explore today. With that, here's the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. What's going on in France? What gets us to this revolution? Why is France going to have really, a lot of people will say the modern period starts 100, 200 years later, but in a lot of ways, we're getting modern right now in the French Revolution.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with what the church is looking like at this point in time, and then build out into what's happening more broadly in French society. So to pick up on the point that you were just talking about, the French church or the church within France on the eve of the Revolution was incredibly divided. When we talk about the French Revolution and French society, we generally use the term the 3 estates. And that's because every member of society belonged to one of these estates. And you can think of them, they're not quite like classes, they're a bit more like castes. And essentially, the first estate was members of the church, the second estate were members of the nobility, and the third estate was everyone else, or the commoners. And so the vast majority of the population sat within the third estate. But if you look at those 3 estates, they all had their own internal tensions and internal divisions. But you could definitely make the argument that it was the first estate, it was the church, that was the most divided. And if you start to have a look at the situation with the church, it's just an absolute mess of competing interests and priorities. And so, and this is very important to understand how the revolution really kicks off, because at key points in time, it will be the church, or in particular, members of the church who were originally commoners, that will push the kind of their weight in favor of the commoners or the third estate and really energize the revolution at particular points in time. Now, there's a range of reasons why the church was seeing a whole bunch of tension. You were mentioning that there were some that were more in the spirit of the Gallican church, where they wanted a kind of separate but equal status for the church alongside the Pope. They wanted to be in communion with the Pope, but they didn't want the Pope to be intervening in French affairs. You also had tensions between the lower clergy, so people that originally came from, say, the middle class backgrounds, or those from the higher clergy, the kind of higher bishops and archbishops, who were almost always aristocrats originally. And so, to give you a taste of what some of this looked like, if you take the Archbishop of Strasbourg, for example, he had a yearly stipend of 450,000 livres per year. A priest would earn about 750, which is a 600 times difference. You then overlay onto that the church is not meant to be a profit-making corporation, but is actually meant to be providing charitable means, poor relief, hospitals, moral and spiritual guidance. And the misuse or the extravagancies of the higher clergy create a lot of resentment and tension between them and members of the lower clergy, who in some cases, particularly if they were in the countryside, might live very, very modest lives. And so the church was really just this can of contradictions immediately prior to the revolution. If we take a step back and then go, well, what about church within French society immediately prior to the revolution? As I said before, nominally, 97% of the country was Catholic. The church also, only being about 0.5% of the French population, owned about 10% of French property, French land. And if you think about land in these times, land and wealth are synonymous. They're joined at the hip, much more than they are today, where most of the richest people in the world have made their money through means other than real estate and direct land enrichment. So the church was in this great position, but if you then scratch under the surface, to your point around things like the Enlightenment and the like, it wasn't necessarily as strong as it might look. 2 years prior to the revolution, in 1787, there was toleration granted for Protestants, which was seen as a real blow to French Catholics who believed that they should have a monopoly on religion within the state. You also have evidence of waning kind of adherence to orthodox views. So, for example, in the century prior to the revolution, the number of pregnant brides almost doubles in number. The number of priests actually almost declines by half. So there's a range of facts that you can look at and go, well, yes, the country is nominally 97% Catholic, but only half of Parisians were taking communion on a regular basis. So just how Catholic France was is a bit of a matter of debate. It's not quite clear. The one thing I would say to that, however, is that particular communities, it very much changed on a regional level. And so you at this point in time, only 1 in 5 Frenchmen would have lived in a community of more than 2,000 people. It is primarily a rural state. If you think about that, the average citizen probably lived in a community of somewhere between 600 to 800 people. If you live in a city and you get on a packed train in the morning, your train could be your entire community that you were living in at this time. So what that meant is that particular communities were still very much true believers, and their priests and bishops played a huge role in their everyday lives. Now, if I take all the step back and go, okay, well, what's this revolution and where are we? Where are we? After the American Revolutionary War, the French participated in that war, and essentially that and other conflicts bankrupted the French state. And the state needed to raise tax revenues because they could not meet their budget deficit as well as service their existing loans. And to do that, they needed to start taxing the first and second estate. They needed to start taxing the church as well as the aristocrats, who, by and large, got out of paying any sort of tax burden. It's a little complicated, but by and large, they got out of it. And so the aristocrats and members of the church, unsurprisingly, said, no, we don't want to pay any taxes, and tried to use it to their advantage. And in many ways, the the French Revolution actually starts a bit more of as an aristocratic revolt than anything else. However, as those groups are arguing for political power, the commoners, the third estate, take advantage of a range of things, including reduced censorship, Enlightenment ideas, and are also powered on by high costs of living and high bread prices and the hardships that those produce, to essentially create a more general revolutionary and revolt-like environment. The royal government is forced to call an advisory body, a traditional advisory body called the Estates General, which hadn't met in almost 200 years. The royal government was quite against doing that because they felt like if they called the Estates General, that would be a nod towards the kind of constitutional monarchy that Great Britain or England at this point in time had. But they had to do so anyway, and sure enough, as the nightmare of the royalists came true, and that advisory body known as the Estates General proceeded to go rogue and unilaterally declare itself the National Assembly and place upon itself powers akin to something like a parliament or a congress, as well as a constitutional convention. And it is worth noting, just before I wrap up there, that at key points in time in the deadlock between the Estates General and members of the government, it was members of the church, particularly the lower clergy, that actually backed the commoners and broke the deadlock in their favor. And so we see initially, although the revolution and the church end up being arch enemies, and you get essentially what is a holy war, you get a de-Christianization campaign, you get a prisoner pope, it's a complete mess. But initially in 1789, you actually get many prominent revolutionaries coming from the lower clergy. And initially, the church, or at least some members of the church and the third estate, not only don't have a hostile attitude towards each other, but are actually working in a cooperative manner.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. Yeah, you bring up so many interesting issues, and I think one of them is, and that I didn't fully understand, was how split each of these estates was. That the third estate, there were bourgeois who were, even though they were technically third estate people, they were pretty wealthy, but then you also had peasants who were completely poor. But even amongst the aristocracy, you had dirt poor aristocrats, and then obviously super wealthy. And then inside of the church, you have these fabulously wealthy bishops kind of in the middle of that, priests and bishops. And then, your town bishop, or town priest rather, who was dirt poor. And it creates all sorts of different politics. Like, you could honestly see why a poor town priest or maybe a bishop of kind of a backwater place might want a connection to somebody like the Pope, because the Pope can be somebody to play off of this bigger bishop. I'm not really, I have to answer to my archbishop in Strasbourg or Paris or something. But come on, guys, let's be honest. The Pope's really the big guy here, and the Pope should be telling you what to do to try and help me out a little bit.
Well, and indeed, so one of the great things about the French Revolution is just before that Estates General, that advisory body, was summoned by the king, all the estates were asked to draft up what in English we call lists of grievances. So each community, each little kind of parish around the country, and then within that, the members of the clergy, the members of the nobility, and the members of the commoners separately drafted up a list of grievances. And so we have thousands of documents knowing what the chief grievances and the chief problems of communities are all across France before what is one of, if not the greatest revolution in modern times. And you can see within those lists of grievances for the church that each individual community has just got its own priorities and its own problems that it's trying to solve. And, the rhyme or reason between them, between geographies it can be so incredibly diverse. But one of the themes that you pick up on, there are some common complaints. And one of them, for example, is absentee bishops. So you'll see priests complaining that their bishop or their archbishop has essentially been installed into that diocese, and then has gone off to the court in Versailles and is essentially living the high life, maybe gambling, maybe drinking a little too much, and is absent from the community that they're meant to be looking after. And so that's, to your point, that's where someone like the Pope or the King would be great to be able to call upon and, ensure bishops of merit and ensure that they weren't absentee. And in fact, some of the reforms that the revolutionaries will force upon the church will focus on some of these common grievances.
Maybe it's a little bit of a break before we jump into the revolution proper. When you're doing your research, do you see a difference? I don't know how much, and I don't think I've gotten to the point where you talk about your sources in specific, but do you get into French sources? Do they have maybe a different spin on it than maybe the French Revolution than what we might get in reading the sources through an English eye, you might say?
So I suppose there's two ways to answer that question. So first of all, I would say a significant number of the sources that I use were originally from French historians or French writers or French eyewitnesses that have been translated into English, which helps give you a different perspective. Although, of course, you can, in the process of translation, kind of change the subtleties and nuances of what the text is trying to convey originally. In terms of the kind of raw French text, I don't speak French, so there is definitely times when I'll see a footnote in an English text, for example, that's referencing a French text, and I really want to understand what that it's maybe a few sentences, and I actually want to try to figure out what's the page or the chapter that source is referencing. In which case, you can kind of reach out to members of the community or the supporters of the show, French speakers that and get them to help translate a larger piece of work, a few pages or the like, so that you can get a better sense of that fact or that quote or whatever it might be that you saw in an English text. But, as someone who's not a French speaker, I am limited in that. So the best that I can do is to make sure that there are French historians and French eyewitnesses that I'm reading, in addition to, historians from other countries. And also a big thing of what I try to do is you're trying to not only read material from contemporaries and eyewitnesses, both inside of France and outside of France at the time, but also in the decades and centuries afterwards. And so if, in my show, I put a premium on bringing in the opinions of historians and contemporaries and eyewitnesses. Some people that you are hearing from, you might hear from someone who has published their work in 2015, and that is then, being compared to or being built upon by someone who has published their work in, 1847. It really varies. There's no shortage of materials on the French Revolution, which means there's a lot of reading to do, but it's also you get quite a good view of the thing.
Initially, the French Revolution really seems to parallel the American Revolution, but then they really greatly diverge. What's happening in the French Revolution? Yeah,
so I suppose so. Absolutely, they initially seem to have much greater parallels, and in fact, initially, just after the revolution commences, the Marquis de Lafayette, who plays quite a prominent role in the American Revolution. He's a member of the Estates General, which transforms into the National Assembly, and he actually introduced a document, the Declarations of Rights of Men, that he, was very much modeled on the American model. But for a variety of reasons, the revolutionaries do not follow the American model. So, for example, they decline to introduce a Senate. They will only have a one chamber in their national legislature. But in terms of why the two diverge so much, that's a complicated question. But in a quick answer, one big thing is that the revolution, you're dealing with a much older country with very powerful, very wealthy institutions, being the church and the aristocracy, and you're dealing with a nation that is literally surrounded by enemies. Now, yes, the English and the Spanish were maybe not the most menacing for the revolution, but in particular, the Austrians, the Prussians, the Holy Roman Empire, the papacy. The revolution really does feel that it's in a corner against entrenched, counter-revolutionary, aristocratic, eventually papal interest. And so that creates a culture of fear and conspiracy that you just don't get in the American Revolution. And that drives the revolutionaries towards war. It will actually be the French that starts the Revolutionary Wars in 1792. And it's the Revolutionary/Napoleonic Wars that gripped the continent for a quarter of a century. And so that's one big thing. You're dealing with a country that has, institutionalized wealthy opposition to the reforms that are being introduced, and can call upon, or at least they think they can call upon, foreign armies to literally, kill the baby in the crib, so to speak. And so that is a big factor as to why you have a very different culture of the revolutionary conscious than you do in the American Revolution, amongst other reasons. But that would be one of the obvious things to point to.
Yeah, one thing that I was thinking is maybe the American Revolution would have gone in a French Revolution if certain things like Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, the more populist aspects, where the American Third Estate, you could almost call them, if they had pushed some of these issues and the central government had lost control of them, and the proper government, the states governments, had really lost control, then you might have seen things really go down a very different path of maybe a more French revolutionary path.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the American Revolution, but one thing that while you were talking that did come to mind is you do have in the French Revolution in particular, Paris is just this giant metropolis for the times. So, we're dealing with a country at this point in time that is about 26 million people. There's only 8 towns or regional centers that are above 50,000 people in size. And Paris is sitting at maybe, call it 700,000. So it is this huge metropolis. And so that gives the heart of the revolution immense power. And you don't quite have, you just don't have the states in the American Revolution, which which are already thinking of themselves as political entities that are joining together. That idea doesn't really exist in France. The old regime, the regime prior to the revolution, had incredibly centralizing tendencies. There was some decentralization initially when the revolution started to get going, but then once the war kicked in and necessity kicked in, it became incredibly centralized again. So you're just dealing with a situation where, for a variety of reasons, the country just was not, it was a much bigger country with a much longer and complicated history, which, combined with the challenges it faced, was quite different. Even though some of the inspirational ideas for the revolution were similar to the American Revolution, the challenges and the situation it found itself in was actually probably more different than most people might think.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Where did the revolution go? How did it, in short as we can, as an overview, go after this point of when it starts to go down the road of more violence and more, it's definitely not going to just be a mild reforms. It's going all in.
Yeah, so it's actually, the revolution's conflict with the church actually has a decent a decent impact on why the revolution, morphs into the revolution that it does. So maybe I'll just start with how the relationship with the church soured, and then use that to springboard more broadly. So initially, as I said, the kind of all-consuming conflict between the revolution and the Catholic Church and the papacy just didn't exist. There were many prominent revolutionaries in the National Assembly, at least initially, that came from the church. However, as the National Assembly started to reform the country, and with the old regime, you're dealing with a very archaic and outdated and just illogical system of government that they were trying to standardize and rationalize, they inevitably started to want to reform the church. And one of the first things that they did, which really created, a fair bit of tension, but wasn't an irreversible split, was they nationalized church property. So the church owned 10% of French land, and depending on the community, they might even own a greater proportion of that land. So they owned almost 25% of the property in Paris, for example. And as I mentioned earlier, the key reason why we get the French Revolution in the form that we do is that the state was facing bankruptcy. They had a financial crisis where they could not pay their bills. And so the revolutionaries looked over to the church with this huge amount of wealth and huge amount of land and pretty much said to themselves, well, we've got a use for that. And so what the revolutionaries did is that they forcibly nationalized church property. And the logic that they used for this was essentially that the reason why the church was so wealthy was that over the centuries, French nationals, French citizens, had donated property to the church, and the church was meant to use that property to provide things like poor relief, to sponsor hospitals, to sponsor poorhouses, to provide education, and also to do things that we would nowadays associate with a secular government, such as maintain, the registers for births and deaths and marriage. And so the new national government, the National Assembly, pretty much said, well, what we'll do is we'll partly take responsible for some of those things. We will start to pay the priests out of the national budget. They will essentially become salaried employees of the state. And as a result, because we're paying the priests and because this land was originally donated to the church for the benefit of the French nation, well, the French nation needs it. And so the way it's going to benefit the French nation is the government essentially seizing it and then selling it off to meet their budgetary demands. Now, initially, this did not create an irreversible split with the church. There were some members of the church that were actually supportive of this. They thought that this would remove some of the corruption of the church, some of the opulence of the church, return the church to its more traditional priorities of preaching and being moral and spiritual guidance and not being caught up in the trappings of wealth. But of course, the vast majority of the church and of course the Pope were dead against this. But then what we have the revolution really kicks off in mid-1789. The nationalization of church property happens towards the end of 1789. But it's in the middle of the next year that things really just go haywire, really. And that's with a policy that's called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. And this policy was seeking to do a range of things, but essentially what it was seeking to do was reform the Catholic Church so that it could be a church that would act in harmony with the new constitutional monarchy and also be separate but potentially equal to the papacy. And so it was seeking to modernize the church. And so what it was seeking to do was introduce a whole bunch of things that some of those lists of grievances had demanded. So, for example, it started to crack down on absentee bishops, and it sought to make bishops and priests be nominated by merit. And so the way that it wanted to do this was actually to introduce elections. I mean, one of the big things about the French Revolution is the introduction of democratic values and eventually universal male suffrage. And so what they wanted to do was introduce elections for priests and for bishops. And the argument was, well, these individuals are now salaried employees of the state. And so therefore, like every other salaried employee of the state, they should be elected. Now, the problem here, there was a few problems here, but one of the key problems here was that meant that any French citizen could participate in these elections, which meant that Protestants, atheists, people of other religions could potentially participate in these elections. It also meant that some of the most passionate believers in the Catholic faith, in particular women, so half the congregation, were not allowed to vote in these elections. So that was one thing that the Civil Constitution did. Another thing was that it tried to standardize the various parishes and dioceses of the country, which resulted in a significant amount of changes. It was trying to standardize things, reduce like the overlap and duplication. But what that meant in that some communities is that their local parish church would have to close down because they were running on the assumption that you'd only have one parish church for every 6,000 people. In a city like Paris, for example, which had 52 parish churches, it would lose it would lose 19 of its parishes. So there was a significant amount of closure of religious buildings and the like as a result of these reforms. And then finally, the main thing that they did, and you'll be able to talk about just how infuriating this would be to a papacy that saw itself as being more muscular, is that they essentially banned bishops from being able to bring in the Pope in any dispute. The king and the French church were completely, were functionally separate from the Roman Catholic Church and the Prince of Rome. They could inform the Pope about what they were up to, but literally that was the extent of what they could do. They weren't allowed to appeal to the Pope to adjudicate on anything, and the Pope was not allowed to get involved in matters of the French Church. They wanted to create a separate entity, and you can imagine just how intolerable that was to the Pope. Now, where this started to really go wrong is that some of the bishops and priests pretty much said that they weren't willing to sign up to this. They weren't willing to have their parish closed. They weren't willing to have Protestants help to elect Catholic priests. And so they started to refuse to comply with the wills of the government. And the government, believing that this really was an administration issue that the church had no right to oppose, and in fact viewed the church as corrupt in some regards, and therefore, of course they were going to resist it, essentially started forcing it through. And eventually they required all priests to take an oath of allegiance to the law and to the country and to the constitution. And about half of the priests across France refused to do so, particularly by the time that the Pope came out and publicly condemned these reforms. And so that then created, what was essentially a schism between the revolution and the church, where you had half the priests of the country willing to swear an oath of loyalty and allegiance to the constitution, and the other half not willing to. And so we call this second group of priests refractory clergy, or non-constitutional clergy, or non-juring clergy. And essentially, they refused to move. They refused to leave their churches. They refused to leave their parishes, and they insisted on continuing to preach, but they did so without the authority of the government. And they would often heckle and intervene and harass those priests who we call constitutional or patriotic priests that did take the oath and were subsequently elected into office. And so all across the country, in every city, in every town, in every small rural community, you start to get this battle between constitutional priests who took an oath to the Constitution and non-constitutional priests who have followed the Pope and who are refusing to obey these new rules. The parts of the country, it very much differs on how this looks like. So in some parts of the country, the proportion of priests that swear the oath versus not swear the oath, maybe you have 80% versus 20%. And in other parts of the country, it might be a more even 50-50 split. There's a whole bunch of analysis about things that might have driven this behavior. So for example, priests that were less financially secure, older priests, were more likely to take the oath because then they could get their salary from the federal government. Those priests that were, say, lived in towns and were surrounded by other priests and not as isolated were more likely to reject the oath. Likewise, priests that had aristocratic backgrounds or more wealthy backgrounds were more likely to reject the oath, while those that were from, say, the lower middle class that really valued the education that they might receive in the church were more likely to take it. So geographically, it's this real hodgepodge where some regions you might get 90% swearing the oath, and in other regions you might get 90% refusing to do so.
I mean, that's really fascinating, and it shows you how diverse it was.
Oh, it's
divisive.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it's the thing about the French Revolution is that you just cannot talk about France as one entity, because at a regional level, it's just so different and so unique. Now, to get to your question of why did this start going, why did the revolution start souring? Well, as the revolution became more and more obsessed with the danger of counter-revolution, of nobles, of aristocrats who particularly had left the country and were now walking around Europe trying to rally Prussian and German and Italian armies to invade and crush the revolution, the revolutionaries, the patriots within France, started to become more and more worried about fifth column elements, about traitors within, about seditious plots. And you've got these priests, literally tens of thousands of priests across the country that are getting up in churches that, that they, from the government's point of view, shouldn't be in, and are preaching essentially that the people should ignore the federal government. And worse still, they are preaching the authority of the Pope. They are maybe preaching various things that collide with the official line from Paris. And so over time, these priests start to be viewed as enemies of the revolution. And so then when you get into a situation where France finds itself at war, that war actually starts quite terribly, and then France starts to get invaded, it doesn't take much to see how these priests go from a nuisance to actually a seditious element that is undermining the war effort and undermining the revolution and in cahoots with the Pope and other aristocrats, and their objective to crush the revolution and to bring back the old regime. And so from there, you can see how the government starts passing laws about banishing priests, forcibly detaining priests and removing them from French territory. And so you can start to see how the snowball starts rolling down the hill. And before long, particularly when the Prussian army is almost at the gates of Paris, these priests, which number half the priests in France, are viewed as enemies of the people. And so that, in conjunction with the war, is really what really radicalizes the revolution, in addition to things like high cost of living, high bread prices, high, the raw necessities of life being quite unobtainable. You get a very radicalized situation, which then leads to quite bloody situations, and ultimately results in a semi-state sponsored de-Christianization campaign.